welcome to the Geotalk. I'm happy to introduce Paul Macey tonight. He has a training from UCT. And I'm wondering, are you also from Cape Town?
Yes, I'm Cape Town born and bred, yes.
Well, yeah. And then since 1999, he joined the Council of Geoscience. And his first job was mapping the Namaqua-Natal Metamorphic Province. And I'll see that he's doing a talk about the Namaqua-Natal Metamorphic Province. So he's the expert. We work in this area for 20 years. So if you have any question or any doubt, I think this is the man to ask, to be with. Okay, he has mapped a lot, wrote many research papers, an expert in Archean, Mesoproterozoic, Neoproterozoic, metamorphic belts of South Africa, Namibia, Morocco, Mozambique, and Madagascar. So he can come from many talks. I'm sure he has many stories to tell. So he's skilled in mapping and in racing away from hyenas. I have a and he has set up a modern mapping techniques short course. And I'm wondering why we don't have this at Wits. It's at the moment based in Stellenbosch. So maybe we can think of this for the future. And I'm just wondering, how can it be that a person with so many skills is not being snapped and work for Wits instead of being at the council? We a lot to talk, but now we go to the presentation of tonight towards a new geodynamic model for the Western Namaqua-Natal Metamorphic Province. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here. The last time I was at Wits was a Student Geo Congress in about 1994, so it's been 25 years. It's also rather daunting to see so many eminent geologists in this group, and also to say it's really exciting to hear that Wits is wanting to move into the Namaqua-land. For those younger people in the group, the Namaqua-land has been the bedrock of developing academics from large proportion of geological academic history in South Africa, and many of the people sitting here have been have got their grounding and done research in the Namaqua-land. So what I'm going to present today is we've had a 7-year mapping program in Namibia under contract for the Namibians and in collaboration with the Namibian Geological Survey. We've collaborated with a large number of universities, and as a result of that had a fairly large number of postgraduate students involved in the program, which I'll talk about a little bit more in introducing the project. That's why we have so many co-authors, and hopefully this will include some Wits scientists going forward, because we just have had another extension up until the end of the financial year, 2019-2020. So I want to just give you a bit of an overview on the project, and then I will start the actual talk, but I want to give you an idea of what we've achieved to this point. So we've mapped 57 50,000 scale maps around about 30,000 square kilometers, focusing primarily on the Namaqua-Natal Metamorphic Province rocks, but also worked on into the Carib-Fold and Thrust Belt, the Neoproterozoic rocks. And our continued work will actually take us into the Carib and further north, which I'll show you now. We've avoided all of these irritating rocks like the Karoo, which cover, and Nama, which cover interesting rocks, but I'm sure that some of you might be interested in looking at those as well.
Paul,
yes?
all rocks are interesting.
Thank you. No, I'm not in disagreement there. Just a stab at the sedimentologists. I used to do one myself once. So this is a new mapping area. In blue shows what we've done up until now, and we are mapping now in the Arse Literates and Spacklebit area, which is a real privilege. No one's mapped there since the 1926. So we were very fortunate that NABDEV is now interested in the basement rocks. Not only are they diamonds, and as a result we've been able to move in there, and we're just finishing off some work around Marenka-Square Canabium of the Kubus-Bremen line. That will also be part of our work. So, oops, I've gone the wrong way. Yeah. So those are the three areas. We also have a Cenozoic project, which we are getting hold of a Cenozoic geologist to do a regional reconnaissance study. We also have a program as part of South Africa's 10-year mapping program, which I was the coordinator up until the end of last month. We have a Namaqua phase of it. You can see up at the top, maybe I can put there. This is the area that we want to map over the next 5 or 6 years. And this is what we currently are mapping this coming year. This is what we did last year. And we've just flown hyperspectral covering all of this area. And for those of you who don't know hyperspectral data, it's a truly a game changer when mapping with very high resolution, both spatial and spectral resolution. So we're very excited about mapping. In particular, this area, we're focusing on pegmatites and pegmatite mapping and trying to see if we can also use hyperspectral to predict some of the different mineralization that we find in the various pegmatites. So this is an example of our 50,000 maps that we produced. That's the Fish River Canyon. This is the Cochranmust Canyon. This is the one that I was chased in by a hyena for about 6 km from there to there with a rucksack full of rocks. This canyon is actually as beautiful as the Fish River Canyon, but it is extremely remote. It was a real privilege to be able to work there. That's the legend. These are very complex areas with 2 billion years of history, so legends are fairly complex. So we are very privileged in Namibia to be able to map with a variety of modern data sets, particularly high-resolution magnetics and radiometrics. They have coverage of areas of hyperspectral, which certainly is a game changer. And we have a look at the original mapping by Blino in '76. Incredible work for a PhD student. This is only part of what he did. He did a massive area all the way to the Hive deposit and did incredible geology. But with modern dating and certainly with modern remote sensing data sets, we're able to make more detailed geological maps. So that's just having a look at the hyperspectral draped over Google Earth. And here you can see just how precise one's mapping can be. That's a marble layer within the Nama cover rocks. But as I say, it's a really powerful mapping tool. So this is how we map the Nama actually at member level using Sentinel data, which is also new data. It's the first member level map of the Nama. And one can see Sentinel also brings out very nice structures in the basement, yellow being the mafics and the pinky colors being the granites. And so again, there's a great assistance from those data sets. And this is a pegmatite-rich domain boundaries, comes out in blue. So as I say, it's a really powerful way of making more detailed maps faster. Right. So we've been making use of, for the first time as an organization, digital tablets using BGS software, Sigma Mobile. There's a picture looking into the Fish River Canyon in the southern parts of the canyon to just give you an idea also of the terrain we've been working in. It's not for the faint-hearted, but of course a great privilege to be able to be traipsing across 100% outcrop all day long. So this is what the Sigma Mobile looks like, and it allows you, it's an ARC add-on, allows you to, in real time, construct a map and to look at all the different layers, all the geophysical layers, remote sensing layers, Google Earth, all at the same time. So this just gives you some idea of the kind of coverage we've done. So each spot is where geologists went to. There are some gaps here because that's Cenozoic cover. But we have about now close to 30,000 structural readings. We've done over 1,400 whole rock geochem, majors, rare earth elements, trace elements across the area, including capturing old data sets. We've done a lot of dating, about 160 new ages. That's probably more now. This is a slightly old slide, probably coming close to 200 ages, which have radically altered our way of thinking how this part of Namaqua land developed. We've also fortunately now got a lot of other radiogenics, and we've now got way more hafnium data. We just haven't actually put that onto the map yet. Johan Dina at UCT has been doing pseudosection work for us, and that has also been very important to understand the tectonic stratigraphy, and that's hopefully what's coming out in bits and pieces in publications, but we do have a paper quite specifically on the metamorphics that should come out soon. So the contract is actually structured to have about a third of the funding is into capacity building for the Namibian Geological Survey. I've been involved in many World Bank projects where capacity building is always a requirement, but never did they put their money where their mouth is. And here there was a great opportunity to start with in-office training, then going to in-field mapping schools, and then on-the-job mapping with geologists from the survey until they actually were weaned off us and were making their own maps, which I'll show you an example of now. So we've had a PhD, 4 MSCs, 8 honours project completed. To date, we still have another MSc project being on the go at the moment, and as I say, we've collaborated quite a lot. And this is the map that was produced by Jason Indongo and Geochemistry of the Hive area, having spent 3 years mapping the area to the east. And they gained, I think, the necessary skills, and under fairly limited supervision, produced, I think, a very high quality map of a very important area. We've also produced 250,000 scale maps based on our 50,000s, and some of you might have seen this map that we produced with Peter Slingsby, which is a hiking map on the one side and the geology of the Fish River Canyon on the other side. They match perfectly. The geology is, I'm told, a little bit difficult, but we have 5 days to hike the canyon and digest the 1,000 words of geology. But it has certainly come with lots of positive remarks, particularly saved a couple of people's lives who had to be airlifted out. And this is the first detailed map that has been produced of the Fish River Canyon. Then, of course, we've been trying to publish as much as we can. These are some of the publications and sheet explanations that have come out. Currently, the sheet explanation sits at about 1,000 pages because it just is so much data coming, such a large area. Right, so as I said, it's a real privilege to work there. This is really amazing. If you're a field geologist, this is the field geologist's dream. And we based ourselves out of camps. This is not done very much in the modern world. And there's actually quite a strong group that don't want us to camp anymore, but actually I think it's a great way to build a team and to do geology in the evenings. You can see us actually sitting around chatting about photographs in the field. Of course, we couldn't do it without landowners' permission. Some landowners are friendly, some are less friendly, especially when you get a note with a bullet through it. So this gentleman wasn't very pleasant, but by and large, most of the areas we're very fortunate. Right, so that's pretty much just introduction to the talk, to what we're doing. And now getting on to the talk. Now, I'm afraid it is 7 years of data that I'm about to bombard you with, so you need to pull those bra straps tight and take out your false teeth, because this is going to be quite a ride. So this is what the talk is today, towards a new geodynamic model. The very first year that I gave a talk, we did 1 year field work, produced 650,000s, and I gave a talk on tracing the tectonic terrains in southern Namibia. And I was primarily trying to define, using what is the accepted idea that Namaqua-land is an accretionary terrain, and each of these different terrains accreted during the Mesoproterozoic. And I used, how do you recognize tectonic terrains? Well, each terrain is a different solicitorography to surrounding terrains. They have different ages, they have different PT conditions and tectonic histories. They have tectonic boundaries and different SMD ages or hafnium ages. And then not that we were doing paleomagnetic, and of course there's no fossils, but basically I try to argue for a accretionary model. Now hopefully by the end of this I will have persuaded you that the accretionary model doesn't work, that rather we're not looking at accretionary terrain, but rather perhaps accretionary terrain in the Paleoproterozoic that was cannibalized and shuffled during the Mesoproterozoic, but is basically Paleoproterozoic rock that has been reworked. So hopefully I can persuade you. This is the classic tectonic stratigraphic map of Namaqua-Land, and that's in the South African textbook. It's based on Bob Thomas's 1994 paper, and we've made some modifications. But another thing we realize is that if you look at variety of publications, the terrain boundaries are put in all sorts of different places. And actually what I found was the most accurate are the ones done by Blino and Bierkes, who are the original mappers in this area. And subsequent to that, too many people have sat behind a desk looking at various maps and coming up with what are implausible terrain boundaries. And all of these had a challenge really around this area, that they couldn't really decide where the boundary was. And that's because I think they didn't recognize what we've now called basically the damage zone between the two domains that I'll explain to you now. Other thing is nomenclature for a starting geologist is really difficult. So the Porphyra Shear, if you look on the end there, has got multiple names. The Porphyra Shear, the Tantalite Valley Shear, Cookhouse Myelenite, the Harlenberg Shear Zone, the Marshall Rocks Porphyra Shear Zone. And anyone starting here would be really struggling to get through all of the old nomenclature. So one of the things we were trying to do is to unify the lithostratigraphy and tectonic stratigraphy across the Orange River. That was the fundamental reason for starting this project. So this is the new tectonic model or tectonic diagram we've produced. Everything sort of east of about Cochranmust, we've taken straight from Thomas. But all of this is now newly drawn, and in particular, we have something called Lefrots, the Lower Fish River Onsie of Cairns thrust zone. And the way that we see this now is that all of these domains, we don't call them terrains because we don't believe they're accretionary origin, so these are different domains, are subhorizontal or low angle slices of crust that are stacked on top of each other, with Ariakob stacked on top of the Cochranmust, stacked on top of Lefrots, on top of the Rucktersveld subprovince, and on top of the Bushmanland subprovince. Ultimately, with almost a pivot sitting around here, just around the Cochranmust area. And I will discuss in particular, since this is our focus area, the Cochranmust, the Lefrots, and the Rucktersveld subprovince, and the data that we have to argue for why we think this is not an accretionary origin. So we come up with this, the so-called Brisé fan model. Got this from my French colleague Luc Chevalier. And basically, what I was just trying to say is we've got thin slices, and the Cochranmust has probably got multiple thrust sheets. In fact, it goes back to 84. Hammond Preckeld had this model already. And we basically see the Cochranmust, which is in orange here, superimposed on top of the damage zone, which is the Lefrots, on top of the lower grade Pellet Domain, and on top of the Bushmanland along the Kruger thrust. We like the model so much, we go, ooh la la! So let's move then into the various tectonic components. The first one is the Rucktersveld subprovince, which is shown here in green. It is made up of two components, the Fjordsdrift domain and the Pellet Domain. The Fjordsdrift domain and Pellet Domain share stratigraphy, but the Fjordsdrift domain is low-grade green schist facies and is not very strongly affected or almost unaffected by Namaqua orogeny, whereas the Pellet Domain is completely transposed by the Namaqua. But you can follow across the units from the low grade into the amphibolite facies area. So let's have a look at them more closely. So this is, I just put this in because I gave this talk but to lay people for the map, and I just wanted to say what we're talking about here is this is the Rucktersveld, is the bread, the Cochranmust is high grade, the toast, and in between is Lefrots, the jam. So we are now going to have a look at the low grade, the Rucktersveld, and they're separated by those thrusts. Okay, so this is the Fjordsdrift domain, and it is a fairly simple stratigraphy. It has the Orange River group volcanics and minor sediments, mostly some few layers or units of quartzites, which are floating in otherwise large amounts of Fjordsdrift sweet granitoids, mostly granodiorite. So that's the The predominant rock is actually this equigranular granite diorite, sometimes porphyritic, with a large amounts of these mafic xenoliths, autoliths in them. Gabbros is the feed to it, and also diorites are also found, but they're volumetrically much smaller. And then in places we do find very well-developed intrusive pegmatites at the boundary between the volcanics and the intruding plutonic rocks. If we move then from the Fjordstrup domain, you can see these belts of Orange River group just get dragged out and become deformed in the Pellet Domain. But ultimately, you're taking the same unit. This was some sort of dacitic metavolcanic, now becomes a quartz feldspar biotite hornblende gneiss. Instead of compositionally banded, the rhyolites have become quartz feldspathic gneisses, and then we find metaquartzites and in places some metapyroclastics as well. And if you look at the Fjordstrup suite, which was before underformed and now they turned into orthogneisses, predominantly these biotite hornblende orthogneisses and algogneisses, and in places leucogneisses. So if you look at the geochemistry, this is our data plus the data of Dave Reed from his PhD in 77, and it forms a very nice subalkaline trend, very typical of arc rocks, everything from gabbro all the way to alkali granites. And if we look at the Fjordstrup and the Pella, they're pretty much the same trends, just a little bit more open system behavior, probably because of the higher grade. And if you look at the difference between the plutonic rocks, or this is the Orange River group, they basically give you the same signature, suggesting they are co-magmatic. If we look at the trace element diagrams, you get typical arc signatures, titanium and the tantalum, niobium, phosphorus and titanium anomalies. And we look at the not the O'Connor plots. Anyway, that shows a arc trend, and if we look at the Pierce diagrams, sitting mostly within volcanic arc terrain. Now, this isn't new. This is what Dave Reed was saying now 40 years ago. But what was interesting is now looking at the ages. So originally, Dave Reed's works showed that there was an age range from about 2 billion all the way down to 1600. So about a 400 million year duration for the arc magnetism. But in fact, our modern age data shows that in fact all the ages are 1885 plus or minus 25 out of 41 or 44 ages. So it's a much more restricted time period in the crystallization ages of both the intrusive and the volcanic rocks. And despite we're always seeing the intruding rocks, the intrusive intruding into the volcanics, they have overlapping ages, so it looks like these arcs were evolving with intruding and extruding rocks developing over the roughly 50 million years that this arc was active. However, we have a look further into inheritance ages and into the model ages. We start to see another story in that we see inheritance of rocks around about 2.0 to 2.1, both in the volcanics and in the intrusive rocks. And the model ages taking us back into the Archean times, or very early Paleoproterozoic. So the idea this was entirely juvenile arc is not true. There is certainly a component of older crust involved. That is different from what Dave had been saying before. The interesting thing was that we didn't know where this inheritance was coming from, and that was another discovery. We actually discovered the earlier arc that these rocks are derived from. So if we have a look at some xenoliths, we find that there's also xenoliths within these the Fjordstrup suite intrusive. They have a crystallization age that's the same as inheritance, and so these xenoliths are effectively what is the material that's being consumed to make the or partially to contaminate the Richtersveld arc. if we have a look at the quartzites, as I said, there aren't many quartzites, but importantly, they also give a detrital age around about the 2 billion. So we got this before we ever discovered what they were eroding. We didn't know where this 2 billion year came from, but despite these being quite far spaced outcrops, we're talking over a range of about 150 kilometers, we find a very similar age pattern, around 2 billion, with some metamorphic overprints at about 1900, which is pretty much the age of the Fieldster Suite. So this is Orange River group, quartzites deriving their detritus from an older piece of crust, and then being captured by the arc itself, or consumed by the arc, and being metamorphically overprinted in some cases. So where do these 2 billion-year-old rocks come from? Well, we moved into the Spectral, Bob Thomas and myself, and we mapped the Aris Mountains, which was a real privilege as well. It never actually been mapped before. It was just called undifferentiated Namaqua rocks. And whilst they look like arc rocks, they actually turned out to have crystallization ages in the 2 billion. So we now have modeled that the xenoliths that we find within the Richtersveld arc are bits of the Spectral arc that are captured and consumed of an earlier arc, maybe 100 million year earlier arc. And it would be really interesting to now do more work in this area and to see is this the juvenile component, or is there even older crust? As I will show you now, that there seems to be evidence of even some Archean crust involved in the arc itself. So we've spoken now about, that's the Richtersveld arc. Let me just summarize maybe. Richtersveld arc at 1885. It consumes an older arc at about 2 billion years. But we also found this outcrop of migmatitic gneisses and agmatites. And I looked at this and said, it looks like nothing what the Pellet looks like, or the Fieldster domain looks like. And it really looked like it was something exotic. So we dated it and found none of the 2 billion ages in there. But we did find some detrital peaks at about 2.6, 2.7, and 2.8 in the Archean. And importantly then have this metamorphic overprint at 1885 and look like this is a piece of Archean crust or Archean derived sediment that doesn't have any of the signature of Orange River group, so it's not Orange River group, that has been also consumed or captured inside the arc. And I looked at a bit at the age, I don't know if I've got it here, next thing here. So, and speculate that it could well be bits of the Karlfeld Kraton if you just compare ages 2.57, 670s about Fentersdorp and Garp and the Central Rand. So is it possible that in fact the Bankwasser pegmatite is a rafted piece of Karlfeld Kraton sitting inside the Richtersveld arc? I think we probably need to do more studies on that, but I think that's at the moment the simplest explanation. I've lost my... So basically, if we again summarize, we have the Richtersveld Metamorphic arc rocks, which have a crystallization age 1885, inheritance at 2 billion, and some early Paleoproterozoic model ages. If you look at the sedimentary rocks, they have detritus that comes from 2 billion. That seems to spare a bit arc, whereas the Bankwasser is some other inclusion of crust sitting around in the Archean that was somehow incorporated into the Richtersveld. Okay, within the Pellet Domain there are some Mesoproterozoic rocks, and they sit mostly right at the top of the domain boundary. This is the Onsiopkans thrust, which comes here, which separates the Pellet from the thrust zone. And just sitting there in the top of the footwall, we have these granites intruding, which give us an age around about 1210, 1220. Very similar to what we would say Little Macquarie in Bushman land, but do seem to be spatially associated with the thrust itself. And And then there are also some amphibolite dikes of similar generation. Right, so if we move, that's basically the description of the Ruchtesveld and its rocks. Now I'm going to move to the Cochranmust domain, which extends from Cochranmust is about there, all the way into Namibia, to Granau area, Granau down to Ice. The Namibians have always called this Granau terrain, and South Africans have called it the Cochranmust domain, and some have extended the Ouse domain to be part of the Cochranmust Granau terrain. We've separated Ouse basically because of age data that Johan Diener's got from the Ouse area, but I've seen more recent data that suggests that it could well be that still the Cochranmust extends all the way to Ouse. But that is where we're going to map in the next few weeks, so hopefully we'll be able to resolve that now. So the Cochranmust domain is granulite facies. As for all of Namaqua-land, we're talking about high temperature, low pressure. Temperatures around about 780 degrees and pressures around 5 to 6 kilobars. So that's why we make it the toast. So that's the low grade, this is the high grade. The stratigraphy of the Cochranmust is actually relatively simple. And this has been one of the really important things, is we've been able to take the stratigraphy of the Cochranmust, which has been very well mapped by my ex-colleague, one of the great mappers of the CGS, Khabi Mun, and transfer that stratigraphy and that understanding into Namibia. But what we find is the oldest rocks that we can find are supercrustals, predominantly made these K-feldspar sillimanite, garnet, cordierite, metapelites, mostly restitic. Some of them do still have leucosome material, but a lot of them are almost pure cordierite. We dated them, got 4 samples. They show very similar detrital zircon patterns, and I've merged them here. And they range in age from about 1350 in detritus all the way down to 1226, which is the youngest detrital zircon. And then we get our first metamorphic zircons rims at around about 1212. So it constrains the age of sedimentation between 1226 and 1212, which is a very tight constraint in a normal situation. So that we call the Naris group. It is intruded by a variety of granites and leucogranites. The largest of it are these peachy colored, that's the enduring sweet, which are these garnet, porphyritic garnet or argon megacrystic argonices. And they're very closely associated with the supercrustals, often have full of contaminated rafts, and probably are S-type as a result of interaction with the supercrustals, with the pellitic supercrustals. Then we get leucogranites shown here in the yellowy orangey color, and then rarely do we find 2-pyroxene granulites shown here in the darker green colors. And these all give an age, fairly tight age constraint between about 1225 and 1190, which actually overlaps with the deposition of the Nari. So everything is kind of happening around the 1200 mark in the Cochranmust. Then significantly later we get intrusion of large volume, the red here, large volume of it, effectively what we interpret to be a dehydration melt, quartz, feldspar, garnet, dry granites, that's here in the background, and see them as being the principal product of the dehydration reactions in the metapelites. They give us an age of 1140. So this is here the age of the sediments, and these are the granites, the mafics, the leucogranites, and now we're talking about the 1140, what we call the Witwater gneisses. And then this is another, I can say, discovery of this project, is rationalizing a late suite of I-type granites. There was a PhD done here by Duplessis in the 80s, who kind of separated out all the granites, but never really got them to be suitably grouped into, so the spectacle, it's not a spectacle, the Witwater and the Enduring and all of these granites were all kind of made singular units, but it's now with the age data we find that there's a very tight constraint, 1125 to 1110, where we intrude these hornblende granites and charnokites with very nice I-type characteristics, and as I say, fairly tightly constrained in age. Right, so if we move over, I just wanted to show that what I just showed you now was this part of that part there of Cochranmust, and we found exactly the same relationships. In the Ice Fish River area. So here's the base of the Cochranmust is the lower Fish River thrust, and we find the exact same. This is the end-ordering suite. The blue are the P-lights, dark blues are sheared P-lights, and then we have in the pink we have the end-ordering, and in the cerise pink, I guess, or bright pink, is the Witwater. So we're finding exactly the same units, and we have the Komsberg suite, these 11, 15 aged I-type granites we find as well within the basal parts of the Cochranmust. So it's a uniform stratigraphy across the area that's been mapped. Right, so now if we move into Lefrot's, this is the one probably most important to get published, because I'm using it fairly widely at the moment, but really need to get the data out there to demonstrate that there is in fact a damage zone between the overriding thrusted Cochranmust thrusting over the Roughness fault. And we, as I call it, the lower Fish River Onsiopkans thrust, because the upper thrust is called the lower Fish River thrust historically, and the lower thrust is the Onsiopkans thrust, so therefore the zone in between got its name, Lefrot's. So this is Lefrot's shown here in grey, and we've been able to map it all the way from the Nomus Kluft area, so Rosh Pinot is sitting about over here, and we see the thrust here, we call it actually the Witbits thrust there, and then it comes down along Onsiopkans thrust, and Onsiopkans thrust gets caught up in the younger Poffer Shear, then comes out on a fairly amoeboid trace as the base, and then we have the lower Fish River thrust as named by Bierkus, and then I recognized it here mapping as a cattle butt thrust, and then through geophysics and mapping we were able to follow it all the way through and under the Karoo. So we now have the zone which has rocks from both the hanging wall and the footwall mixed in, highly strained, plus, amazingly, rocks that don't belong to either the footwall or the hanging wall, and appear to come from further domain to the north, such as the Kontkip, or to the east, the Ariakab, and even from the Bushmanland sub-province. So somehow we've got rafts of, or slices of other domains getting caught up into this thrust zone. So this is, if we go, I'll go back one, that picture is actually the picture across this thrust, the Witbits thrust as we called it. And there's the Pellet Domain, and hopefully most of you would agree there's a fairly large change in the degree of strain, and we go into the Lefrot's. The rock types are similar, but the degree of strain is highly increased. If we then move from this area and actually look at Lefrot's in the area of ice, so ice is pretty much there. This is the Fish River coming down here, and it is the area which is about 60-kilometer wide zone between the upper thrust, lower Fish River thrust, and the Onsiopkans thrust. And what do we find? Well, we find 1885 Richtersveld material. We find some slices of the Cochranmust in there as well, but then we find a whole lot of 1280 material, a large proportion. So we're talking about all of this orange material here, all of that orange there, all of this orange here, and they don't come from either the footwall or the hanging wall, and 1280s is more akin to the Ariakab domain or the Kontkip domain. We also find pegmatites here that are 1830 in age, which don't belong to the Richtersveld either. That's more closer to the Gladkop suite in the Bushmanland terrain, sub-province. There's also within the the thrust domain, we get sheets of syntectonic granites, date 1126. That's also Comsberg that we saw here in the Cochranmust domain. And this pretty much is a good time constraint on when thrusting is happening in Lefrots. So we have to, of course, have some evidence that we see thrusting. And hopefully most of you would agree that we have some really nice duplexing structures, horse structures developed. This is in the Fish River. And I would love someone to follow this up and do some proper work. Of course, we have to keep moving, covering a very large area. These rocks are highly attenuated, most commonly almost L-tectonites, and just on their physical appearance, they're very different from either the Pellet or the Cochranmust in the degree of strain that we see in them. And it's sort of a textbook examples of thrusting. Now, if we move further down, this is the Runabout area. The Lefrots is dominated by Enduring sweet sheets of granite. At the top and the bottom of the Lefrots, we have these bimodal metabasites and felsignices, which is shown in green and orange here. We also find within the Clippin, these are the famous Kumkum, Tantalite Valley, Sunfontaine, Clippin, and perhaps even Koselska Bank in South Africa, which give us these pellitic granulites associated with Tantalite Valley Complex or Kumkum Suite, mafic rocks shown in the greens. And what we find is that we get the pelites look very similar to the pelites I spoke about now in the Cochranmust. They're granulitic, but they have a very restricted age range that looks nothing like the age range, detrital ages in the Cochranmust, with a peak around about the 1950 in age. So suggesting that it comes from a mixture of Sperrgebiet-Arc and Ruchtesveld, and that seems to be the source. Now it could just because it's proximal, but since they're pelites, it seems unlikely. You would expect them to be fairly distal and to be representative of a fairly large area. And this is then we've also dated the Kumkum Suite, these norites, also around about 1212 and 1213, which is the same as the mafic rocks that we found in the Cochranmust. Then we have this large sheet of Enduring argonices. These are typically often garnetiferous, and depending where you are, if you're in the center of the sheet, fairly underformed, but when you get to the margins, either at the top or the bottom of the sheet, they get highly attenuated and end up being streaked gneisses. And they also have a really restricted age range around about the 1200 age. Then we also found a third granulitic pelite that was retrogressed within Lefrots, which we call the Fleursdrift schist. And it again had a completely different detrital pattern, with the youngest detritus actually sitting around about 1164, and suggesting we've got even younger age of sedimentation. So we've got at least 3 ages of pelite deposition at around about probably 1700, 1800. Then we've got the 1200 and 1215 or so, and then 1164. Right, so if we have a look at the ages of what is inside Lefrots, so Lefrots has got a whole bunch of 1800 to 1900 ages, which is typical of what we find in the Ruchtesveld-Arc and Sperrgebiet-Arc, but it also has a bunch of ages around the 1200s, 1100s, and up to the 1300s. So where could those come from? So these are very typical of the the hanging wall Cochranmust. These are very typical of the footwall Ruchtesveld, and then we have some of these that are kind of sticking out that don't belong to either, and that's why I say possibly could come from the overlying Kip and Oriacha domains. Right, so moving on from lithostratigraphy and I guess the geochronology into the deformation. Well, we like to use Pitcher Bear's original 1986 subdivision of the tectonics, mainly because it's what you can observe in the field. The geochronology has shown us, though, that these are complex polyphase events, especially D2, which I'll talk about now. But when you go to the field, you can see a D1, you can see a D2, foliations and lineations, and D3s and D4s. So while some of my co-workers, particularly Christy Rowe, would like me to have something like 12 different deformation events, I prefer to keep in these broader events and then maybe have these A, B, and C phases. So the first recognizable deformation we see is in the Orange River group rocks in the field drift domain. As I said, it was a green schist facies, and you get a nice sort of tightly folded sediment, well-developed slaty cleavage. But importantly, they're cross-cut. This fabric is cross-cut by the field drift suite rocks. So we know the Orange River group is around about 1900. We know the field drift suite's about 1885. So this deformation must be very much in the evolving of this arc around about 1885, 1900. So that's the D1 event. The name was given the Orange River orogeny by Lino or Bierkus for both, I think in the 83 paper. So moving on from D1 to D2, this is now the first of the Mesoproterozoic Namaqua origin rocks. This is in the Pellet Domain, and we see a penetrative gneissic fabric, a well-developed stretching lineation that we can see, the L2. And we must know this is younger than about 1215 because that's the age of the rocks. And we've calculated temperatures, or Johan Dinner did, amphibolite 660 and about 4 kilobars. We'd go to D2 in Cochranmust domain. They look the same. We see again the penetrative foliation and lineations well developed. But we also see Witwater granite, or the Lucca granite that intrudes across, but also within the fabric, and seems to be a syntectonic intrusion, suggesting that in fact D2 in Cochranmust is, although coaxial to what we see in the Pellet Domain, is significantly younger. Temperatures associated, or metamorphic conditions associated with this deformation is significantly higher at 5 kilobars and about 800 degrees Celsius. So what is the timing of thrusting? Well, we've got two phases of thrusting in our model. You can go into the Kumkum farm and you can actually stand on the thrust. You can dangle your genitalia across the thrust, 1 foot on one side. There's a granulites on here, and there's amphibolites there. Really one of the most beautiful soul thrust features I've ever seen. There is my colleague Conrad standing on two dikes which were dated at 1210, so the thrusting must post-date 1210. It has to be, so therefore this thrusting has to be after you've made the 1215 rocks, but younger than, younger than the 1215 but older than those dikes which get cut off. Then we have a second thrusting, which is constrained by, firstly, I mentioned the Philosophy of shifts, which gave it a trital age, youngest Tritus of 1164, so it must be younger than that. But importantly, within the Cochranmust, we have something called the Narrows granite as part of the Komsberg suite, which dates at 1115 down to about 1110, and it is cut off by the thrust and has a fabric just as you approach. So this thrusting must have happened post the 1115. So that is the timing, and this is very similar to the timing that we are saying is the end of deformation in Bushman land. If we look at the spectacle paper, or in the other parts of the Cochranmust, if you look at the Cambridge paper, all show that the main deformation, the main ductile fabric formation must have happened after 1115 or so. Metamorphic conditions within the Lefrots is a slightly higher pressure, but again down to lower temperatures of around about 650 degrees Celsius. Right. So subsequent to this, we now, at that stage now, we've basically stacked these low-angle sheets of crust. Cochranmust and double Lefrots on top of Ruchtesveld. And then we have a basin and dome type overprinting. Mostly the domes, so the basins are completely sheared out, so it's mostly domes. And this is probably best indicated by the geophysics. So this is, again, this is the Fish River coming down here. But here's the Cochranmust dome. This is a typical example of the of one of these domes, the size of them. But there's another dome sitting here, and in fact there's a dome sitting here, and it's the reason why this thrust zone is amoeboid, because it's now being refolded. In fact, this low-lying D2 fabric is being steepened as well by the D3. So there, hopefully you can see that as a dome. But if you look at the geophysics, i.e. we strip off the Nama, you can see in fact that there are a number of these domes. And so the thrust itself comes around here, it comes in and comes back out, and it's been refolded by essentially these shears, by these mega scale folds. Moving to the Runabout area, you see the dome and basins, but yeah, the axes have been dragged in by the D4 shear. If we then move on to the D4 shear zones, this is most well known as the porphyry shear, but we also mapped out a new shear zone called the Eureka shear zone and renamed what was called the sumps shear zone as the spal and splits. We renamed it because there's a sumps formation, so to avoid confusion, and recognized a large number more of these. And in fact, in South Africa, there's a whole bunch more of these so-called D4 dextral subvertical transcurrent shear zones. So this is the porphyry shear. I had two master students doing projects along here, this river. They named it the Cochranmust. So this is the Cochranmust section, mainly because I left them there for a fairly long time and it was fairly hot, as it is. And there you'll see a very nice drag into the shear zone, what we call the initial ductile drag, overprinted by younger myelinitic to cataclastic shearing that goes even more brittle as this shear zone evolves. Importantly, there is a direct correlation between D4 shearing and pegmatites. And I think that's one of the main outcomes of this, is that you can work it both ways. If you see pegmatites, it's somehow related to D4. If you see D4, you should expect to find some pegmatites. Not only pegmatites, but also an associated granite suite called the Runabout granite. Here's a subvertical porphyry shear, and you will see it has these pegmatites running parallel to it. And this is a cross section by one of my master students doing section. This is actually where the Onsiakan's thrust, shown here by the teeth, is actually caught up inside the porphyry shear. It was a very challenging area for young geologists to work in, where you have subhorizontal thrusting followed by subvertical myelinitic shearing, and into that has bled now all of the pegmatite intrusions. So back to the toast example, yeah, we see this dextral shearing, and this is also another master student who just finished working on isotopes of the pegmatites. We can see this relationship between shear zones and the bleeding all the pegmatites. So the pegmatites like to run along D4 shear zones as well as reactivate the D2 thrust structures. And I'll show you that to you in more detail now. This is the Runabout granite, which is associated with the pegmatite. They cross-cut each other, so they are coeval, and they also sit in the same structural sites. So that's the Runabout granite, and I think I've got a picture. No, I don't have a picture of pegmatite, we'll know what pegmatite looks like. Now each of these numbers this was this MAC looking at structural emplacement of the pegmatites by Chris Lambert, my colleague. And basically, you see number one here is where we have the spal and split shear and we have the porphyry shear. Similarly, we have the Eureka shear, and we have these massive tension gushes developing, and you effectively bleed into as these two shear zones move past each other. We have these rigid bodies sitting here within the Tantalite Valley, Sunfontaine, and there's massive amounts of pegmatite intruding into the Boudin eyes that these things develop as the more ductile rocks draped around these rocks at different rheologies Professor Kinnard has done work here. Apparently they've done a lot of drilling uranium into the pegmatites. We also see, made the point earlier that we have pegmatites intruding into the D. This is a D2, that's the on-supercast thrust, and so they intrude into those, basically taking D2 during D4 and reactivating it. And it's pretty much like you have wherever the rheology is variable, so you bleed granite and pegmatite into these areas. I think this has real significant implications for pegmatite research and exploration, bearing in mind that's a hot commodity at the moment. I think the next step is to say, is there some kind of link to types of mineralization that we can find, depending on what structural sites they're in. Just moving over to the ice area, there's the Fish River coming down here. So here's the porphyry shear, and there's a splay over it called the Drycorp. It again shows how we have majority of the pegmatites and the Runabout associated with the shearing. And also this is the large mafic intrusion, which you find at ice, what we call in the Spalen Spitz, Gabbro. It is also full of pegmatites and Runabout granite, and we see that as being because it's basically a rigid body that acted in a more brittle nature during D4 shearing and made enough plumbing to intrude all of this melt. Okay. So the ages of the pegmatites vary anything from being underformed parallel to being highly sheared, and so we feel that the pegmatites themselves were intruding during the duration of the evolution of these D4 shears, and they date between about 1035 and about 968, but if we take out the outliers, we probably say from about 1005 to 960, 970 or so. So it's about 40 million years that the porphyry shear was active. Okay, so trying to wrap all of this together into one story and come back to comparing a accretionary model to some other model. So this is kind of a, I guess, in conclusion. So what is the significance of this data, these new data, to a broader Namaqua tectonic stratigraphy? So we traditionally have a model where these are individual terrains which were accreted up against the Karfol Craton during the Namaqua. And if you look at just the crystallization ages, well, that seems to work. So we have the Cochranmust sitting here, and we have the Ruchtesveld and Spergebit sitting there, and there's a beautiful thrust domain boundary between them, whole zone. So yes, sure, these look like they are two different pieces of crust, or these two exotic terrains. But when one starts looking at the inheritance ages and looking at the model ages, you start to see, well, in fact, the Cochranmust has a large amount of inheritance from the Ruchtesveld and Spergebit. And as such, we now would model rather that the Cochranmust is the Ruchtesveld and Spergebit, but that you've now cannibalized this crust. Just how you do that at such high temperatures and you remain buoyant for this long period of time, that is a challenge, and something why one needs to speak to, as my colleague always called, the slim corp at the universities, to try and give us an idea of how these processes could work. There's also even some model ages that go all the way into the Archean, and these are the things that we're also seeing in some of these Archean aged Bankwas and pegmatite inclusions. So say there's the Ruchtesveld. If we even add in the Pellitic rocks and their detritus, again we see the detritus in Lefrots and in Cochranmust still has a Ruchtesveld age as well. So these terrains could never have been very far apart. You can't say that they had an ocean separating them. They were juxtaposed in some way, either vertically or horizontally, or both. Then also there are these 1200 to 1300 or even slightly more ages, which is neither Cochranmust or Ruchtesveld. That seems to be Ariachop and Kronkip. So they also. So what do we then suggest? Well, perhaps the model could be, since we have Paleoproterozoic crust all the way along the margin of Karfol Craton, we have it here in Rucktersfeld, as I've spoken about now, and we have bits of Archean material floating in the Rucktersfeld. So is it possible that the whole of Namaqua-land, not Natal, as we've seen in that juvenile Bob Thomas's work, is in fact originally a Paleoproterozoic block that was accreted to the Kafel Craton during the Orange River orogeny around about 1.85 million years ago, and then during the Mesoproterozoic you simply had a tectonic shuffling and a high temperature cannibalization of this crust over a very long period of time. What evidence do we have for the rest of Namaqua-land outside of our study area being Paleoproterozoic sourced? Well, if you look at the model ages, is a collection of many people's work, and we see that the blues are all Paleoproterozoic ages or older, and the whole of Namaqua-land, bar for one or two ages here, which are Ariaka, which have long been seen as possibly being a juvenile rift basin or oceanic basin, but there are not many samples there in their own right. But for the rest of Namaqua-land, it certainly looks like we are reworking Paleoproterozoic crust, or there's a massive Paleoproterozoic inheritance in the Mesoproterozoic rocks. And if we look at the geochemistry coming out of papers in Bushmanland and in Cochranmust, we see the geochemistry is all volcanic arc, but it's very clear that Mesoproterozoic isn't a volcanic arc system, and again we feel that that volcanic arc signature is just an inheritance from the source rocks that you are melting during this cannibalization. Okay, so the other question is, we now have this long duration and cyclical low pressure, high temperature Namaqua orogeny, starting around the 1300, going all the way down to 1000, that's 300 million years of quasi-static cyclical behavior. How do you do that? And again, that's something that I'd love for us to have many conversations about. But what we are seeing as in the data is that we have initially, normally a mafic melt followed by a alganese melt or granite melt followed by liquid granite melts. And this happens at 1300, and then about 60, 80 million years later again, and we do it again, and then at the end we don't have many mafics, although if we add in Bushmanland, then we put in the Copperberg suite, and we start to see cyclical mafic. Because one of the problems here is we seem to be, or one of the constraints is that we see low pressure, high temperature for 300 million years. How do you keep up the high thermal gradient? Well, you need to probably put in mafic melts. And before, there was no real evidence where this mafic melt was and what the ages were, but at least we have some evidence now suggesting every 60 or 80 million years or so we are seeing intrusions of mafic melt. The actual axis of where this happens seems to change, so that the intrusion or the highest heat flow seems to move across the origin with time in a fairly diachronous sense. If we look at the deformation, that's also cyclical. We seem to have, this is a intrusive event related to a thrusting, and we have another intrusive event related to thrusting, and here we have dactyl shearing with an intrusive event. So again, there's a complete connection between the tectonics and the magmatics. And in between all of this, we also have to have two phases of sedimentation as a minimum. So we are bringing rocks up to the surface, putting sediments on them and taking them back down again, all within the cyclical system. So the model that has been proposed by Julia Bile and Stefan Buttner and co has been some sort of continental back arc model, where you could have this long duration, where you have continuous mafic underplating. It allows you the low pressures and probably the long duration. The pressures don't allow you to ever get any kind of crustal overthickening, which is also you would expect in the case of accretion models, continent-continent collision, that you would have overthickening, and that's probably another, perhaps a nail in the coffin for a accretion model. So we support the Bile model at this stage anyway, and I'll I will finish off what we still need to do to prove the model, because I think that's an important thing. But we propose that this long duration of consistent low pressures and high geothermal gradients was achieved through mafic underplating, as proposed by Dave Waters many, many years ago, with heat transfers supported by multiple phases of thrusting, which we then had mafic intraplating, and crustal melting that evolved from being granitic to lucrigranitic, and becoming much more from a mantle plus crust to some mantle and crust to almost entirely crustal melts. And then compressional phases within the system were interspersed with phases of extension, and we had to have some basin deformation into which sediments were deposited, which then were recycled by the next compressional phase within the system. So that's me. Moses heading down into the Fish River, doing our mapping. Again, a great experience that was too, although like nobody else, everyone walks down the river, we had to go up every tributary, and our rucksacks got heavier because of course we had to fill them with rocks. So, but it was a great experience. So that's me. Thank you.